Should be going live. It says it's live.
Yeah, participant numbers are climbing, so that's an indicator too.
I was expecting I would see a second window, but I'm not. I'm going to join with the monitor session.
I can see us over there, Dave.
Yeah. All right. Yep. I will go ahead and show my video.
Welcome, everyone. This is Kelly Perales, co-director of the Midwest PBIS Network. I'm just going to wait 30 more seconds here before we get started because it looks like participants are still joining our breakout. Okay, to respect everyone's time, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. This is session A6 on applying the multi-tiered framework to suicide prevention. Here in a minute, I will introduce the main presenters for today's session. Before we get into the topic, I want to take a few minutes and just refresh everyone on finding everything within Pathable. With 3,500 people joining this morning, I think that there was a little bit of lagging and some of you may have missed some of the early information about how to navigate this portal. And the good news is, if you're with us right now, you were able to find the session and hopefully you're seeing the PowerPoint on the screen at this time. I want to point out that once you join the session, you will notice that you can interact in the chat pod with your comments. There is also a tab called polls where you can enter any questions that you have. And we're going to give about 60 minutes of presentation, and then we're going to allow 15 minutes at the end to respond to any questions that you type throughout our time together. If you accidentally navigate away from viewing the session, you can get right back in by clicking on the navigation menu and then click back into the session. If you get stuck, there's a tab that says Help Desk. You can click on there and you will be able to get support from someone on our team. And so for our session today, these are the objectives that we're hoping to cover. We want to make sure that you're able to describe in your own words how to use the multi-tiered logic to situate suicide prevention within the PBIS framework. You'll be able to describe essential factors to consider when differentiating professional development experiences associated with suicide prevention in schools. And also, you'll be able to identify resources, tools to support your endeavors, including postvention, to situate suicide prevention within PBIS. Before we get started, I just want to give a word of caution. talking about mental health and suicide prevention are understandably sensitive topics. I think it's really important that we acknowledge this reality, and we want you to know that there are resources available if you yourself or someone you know is experiencing crisis level or even non-crisis level distress. And so there's a National Suicide Prevention Hotline here, as well as the crisis text line. And just remember, from our expectations for our virtual forum, we want to make sure that you're taking care of yourself and your own wellness and mental health needs. And so if any of the content today causes you to have some stressful feelings, please make sure that you're taking care of yourself. So at this time, I want to introduce Tim Noster and Danielle Epson from the Bloomberg University McDowell Institute, and they are going to give the main portion of the presentation today.
Thanks, Kelly. Welcome to everybody. It's a real pleasure for both Danielle and I to be here. We want to start by building on what Kelly opened with in terms of acknowledging the rising concerns about children's mental health across our nation, which is not something new by any means, but it still is important to acknowledge it nonetheless. As many of you may or may not be aware, major depressive disorder in adolescents, as well as death by suicides, along with attempts, have been rising at alarming rates for a number of years. Each year, an estimated 1 in 5 children in the US experience mental, emotional, or behavioral disorders, including but not limited to anxiety and depression. However, according to the CDC, out of this growing population of kids, only about 20% of those children receive any form of specialized mental health treatment. So as a result, schools in many ways have actually become the de facto mental health provider for a lot of our youth in our nation. As alarming as these noted trends have been, what makes them even more alarming is that they represent the state of affairs pre-COVID or pre this pandemic that we're in. So while none of us have a proverbial crystal ball with any degree of reliability about it, it appears reasonably safe to say that our degree of uncertainty and associated struggles with the current pandemic will not help to reverse these alarming trends. As essential perspective that serves as a common frame of reference as you go through this presentation today, we encourage you to keep in mind the following. Is that suicide happens when physical and emotional pain exceed hope. In other words, to paraphrase a survivor of their suicide attempt, people don't want to die by suicide. They simply want their pain to end, and they see no other hopeful way of it ending. When we consider the increasing number of deaths by suicide in the US over the past decade, it's noteworthy that 1 in 5 of us during our lifetime are likely to experience a suicide within our family, depending on however we define our family constellation. With respect to youth suicide, while we don't want to over-pathologize adolescents by any means, there are some unique risk factors associated with school-age youth to consider, including impulsivity, risk-taking behavior, peer group influence, limitations in understanding the permanency of suicide, as well as a number of other kind of mitigating factors. We've organized this session today around 4 major themes, which to varying degrees are very much all interrelated. However, of course, we'll address these or present these in somewhat of a linear fashion today. First and foremost of those themes is to start by using already available school and community-based data associated with risk and protective factors. Secondly, know going into the process that you'll need to gather additional targeted data on the impact of trauma-informed approaches, as well as suicide prevention endeavors in your schools, and in turn, utilize that data to inform your planning. The third theme is that it's important to view, to some degree, somewhat normalizing, if you will, suicide prevention, applying multi-tiered logic in schools through multi-tiered systems of support. And last but by no means least, it's important to be prepared in advance for postvention in the event that postvention is needed. So I'm going to turn it over to Danielle here, and she's going to take us into this first major theme throughout this session in terms of starting by using already available school and community-based data.
Thanks, Tim. So let's get started by looking at accessing already available school and community-based data. Many states support their school systems in conducting periodic youth surveys that tease out information about risk and protective factors associated with social, emotional, and behavioral wellness. These data are, without question, based on our experiences, a goldmine of information. Further, when we strategically use these data, we can guide our efforts to enhance the social, emotional, and behavioral wellness of your students and prevent youth suicide. To illustrate, one example of this type of state-supported assessment is the Pennsylvania Youth Survey, or more commonly known as the PBIS. So the PBIS is a voluntary survey conducted with 6th, 8th, 10th, and 12th grade students to learn about their behavior, attitudes, and knowledge concerning risk and protective factors in their lives. The types of questions posed are relevant to school, home, and community life. The survey is conducted on an every other year basis and is sponsored by the Pennsylvania Commission on Crime and Delinquency in collaboration with the Pennsylvania Department of Education. More than 4 out of every 5, or greater than 80% of school districts in Pennsylvania conducted the PBIS during the most recent cycle in 2019. The primary focus of the PBIS is on providing school leaders with critical information concerning changes in patterns in the use and abuse of harmful substances and behaviors, and assessing risk factors that are related to undesired behaviors and the protective factors that help guard against concerning behavior. So how is the PBIS report organized? Beyond the demographics, the PBIS report that participating school systems receive follow the interrelated domains of information: ATOD, or alcohol, tobacco, and other drugs, use and access; antisocial behavior; community and school climate safety; social and emotional health; systemic factors; and lastly, risk and protective factors. It is important to note that each of these domains also have subsections. For example, let's look at social emotional health domain to see what associated subsections lie within there. These data that emerges from the battery of survey questions associated with this particular domain are further organized within the participating school systems report to reflect mental health concerns and suicide risk, depression and substance use, bullying, depression and suicide, as well as transitions plus mobility, sleep patterns, grief, and other stressful events that may be present in the student's life. There are 2 primary ways in our experiences that data such as these from the PBIS are utilized by school systems. The first way is to inform strategic planning to identify needs and gaps in the services and programs in order to develop action plans to address those needs and gaps. In this sense, ideally, the strategic planning process should reflect multi-tiered logic and be guided by the development of a logic model. The second, yet related way these types of data can be used is to provide a baseline to which to compare data that emerges from future administration of this type of assessment instrument to track progress towards established targeted goals and measurable outcomes. So let's look at a brief example to see how data such as the PBIS can be used to track progress towards established goals. In Milton Area School District, which is located in Pennsylvania, an array of trauma-informed programs and practices were installed, along with associated fidelity measures where applicable, in this district between 2015 and 2019. These programs and practices emerged through the development of a strategic plan reflecting multi-tiered logic. And these programs and practices that were installed are continuing today. So the programs and practices implemented during these past few years have predominantly focused on universal prevention, or Tier 1. However, there are examples of work done at the advanced tiers of the PBIS framework. So the following figures on the next several slides, while they're not exhaustive, will help to illustrate measurable progress over the years in this particular school district as measured through the PAYS. The initial target established as depicted on this slide was that the percentage of students reporting risk factors associated with depression or suicide would decrease by 10% by the end of the 2018-2019 school year. In order to address this goal, the district increased its focus on high fidelity implementation of the PBIS framework across all buildings in concert with incrementally rolling out expanded screening, social emotional learning curricula, and substance abuse prevention programming. As depicted in this slide, the district actually exceeded its target goal by achieving more than 20% reduction across 3 interrelated questions related to depression and suicide within PAYS. Relatedly, the district also initially targeted that the percentage of students reporting having experienced bullying would decrease by 10% by the end of the 2018-2019 school year. Emphasis was placed on prevention as well as increased awareness and skills to intervene with bullying when witnessed by both staff and students. While the degree of decrease was not as robust as depicted in the previous slide, in aggregate, the district was able to still achieve this targeted objective. In a related manner, the district concurrently targeted a 10% reduction in threats and actual acts of violent behavior on school property during the same time frame. As can be noted in this figure, the district dramatically decreased the number of threats of violence by 36%, as well as reduced by 47% actual acts of physical violence over the past few years as measured through the PAYS. Beyond the data previously depicted, the district also targeted risk factors associated with access and use of alcohol, tobacco products, and prescription drugs. To this end, the district partnered with its local county-based drug and alcohol prevention program and increased efforts on messaging campaigns targeting both students and their families. The PAYS data depicted in this slide indicate significant decreases across each of these risk factors noted. Having shared these examples, one additional example of a risk factor associated with stress merits illustration for not only the purpose of highlighting improvement, but most notably for the focus on non-academic barriers to learning. To this district's credit, they established interventions to address food insecurities within their local communities. The district already had been operating a traditional breakfast, lunch, and an after-school food program. While these programs were thought to be somewhat effective, the district specifically expanded this program in tandem with identifying and removing stigmatizing factors associated with the program. As can be seen in these data, they were able to achieve a 37% reduction in reported worry by students about their family running out of food, as well as a 38% reduction in students reporting that they had skipped a meal because the family did not have enough money for food. So in short, the use of accessible school and community-based data is highly encouraged to both inform development of strategic action plans, as well as measure the efficacy of interventions as measured through the same types of data.
So building on what Danielle was sharing in terms of the pay, beyond using the already available school and community-based data that might exist, such as the PAYS that we just walked through, the second major theme we want to emphasize in this presentation is that of gathering additional targeted data in your endeavors moving forward. In a general sense, you're encouraged to organize the collection and use of these additional data in two distinct yet aligned ways, somewhat sorted into two proverbial buckets, if you will. The first of these two types of information, or buckets, focuses on gathering additional information about risk and protective factors associated with the social emotional wellness of, at a minimum, students as well as the staff. With respect to students, you may want to consider further targeted surveys with students that self-identify as members of vulnerable groups, such as the LGBTQ+ community. Ideally, these types of additional data can be used in concert with aggregated data that emerges from universal screening that may already be present and occurring in your school system. Specific to suicide prevention, use of gated screening procedures are recommended for consideration. To illustrate, in some schools, they administer a specific suicide risk assessment protocol, such as the PHQ-9 or the Youth Suicide Risk Screening Form, with students that emerge as appearing as at risk through universal screening or based on faculty referral through the school student assistance process. In a parallel manner, you're also encouraged to consider the social emotional well-being of staff working in your schools. This is particularly important today given our collective experiences with this pandemic. The issues associated with both compassion fatigue as well as secondary traumatic stress and vicarious trauma are as relevant today as they've ever been. This can be considered within the context of your employee assistance programs formally or through other means as is relevant in your school systems or structures. The second type of additional information you're encouraged to gather and use focuses on the impact of professional development programs being implemented associated with trauma-informed approaches and suicide prevention. It's encouraging that school systems are increasingly providing training on trauma-informed approaches as well as suicide prevention for youth. However, one glaring gap in this approach to date has been the limited degree of evaluative data concerning the impact of this type of professional development. Acknowledging that it's important to measure the effects of curriculum instruction with students and learning, we would argue that it's equally important to assess the impact of professional development in actually skill development and utilization of those skills by professional staff, as well as paraprofessionals. Let's explore this a little further through one illustration with what's commonly referred to as gatekeeper training. Youth mental health first aid is one example of an evidence-based suicide prevention or gatekeeper training that is increasingly being rolled out across schools. Given the importance of this type of training, coupled with the labor intensity associated with organizing and providing youth mental health first aid, it's important to assess the impact on the practices employed by the staff that once they've completed the training. One example of assessing the impact of youth mental health first aid training that we have been directly involved with over the past few years is in conjunction with our statewide efforts across educator preparatory programs in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. The approach that we've been employing is a time-staggered two-stage series of brief surveys administered through Qualtrics. The first survey occurs shortly following completion of the initial training and assesses the perceptions of what was learned. The second survey is then administered about 3 to 4 months later and assesses actual impact in terms of self-report of use of the skills developed. This particular next slide that we're looking at depicts the array of questions reflected in this first survey of the two noted previous surveys. Certain types of reflective statements, such as the following, are posed in this series of 12 questions. As a result of youth mental health first aid training, I'm more aware of how social, emotional, and behavioral matters might influence student learning. Another example is, as a result of youth mental health first aid training, I'm able to effectively reach out to a student who may be experiencing a mental health challenge. As well as a third example out of these 12 is, as a result of youth mental health first aid training, I'm better able to ask a student whether they are considering self-injury and/or suicide. Now, when we look at data reflected from our experiences, this slide, along with the following slide that you'll see in a moment here, depicts patterns from more than 600 pre-service educators that have completed this voluntary survey over the course of the past 2 years. The response rate was around 25%, as the total number of pre-service educators that actually completed youth mental health first aid training through this initiative in the last 2 years was close to 2,600 individuals. Given the high rate of strongly agree or agree responses, as depicted in this slide and as you'll see in the next one, the decision was made to further expand this initiative to the point where it's projected that approximately 4,000 pre-service educators will complete youth mental health first aid training across 33 institutions of higher ed by the end of this current calendar year in 2020. And that's despite the COVID pandemic. This next particular slide is just further depiction of those same data, and you'll notice this similar data trends in terms of the high proportion that are indicating strongly agree as well as agree. Now, beyond this first survey, which really gets at perceptions of what is learned, this particular slide depicts the array of questions posed to this same group of pre-service educators about 3 to 4 months after they've completed the initial youth mental health first aid training. This survey hones in on the implementation of the skills learned through the training with PK to 12 students across a variety of field-based experience sites, including in some instances, student teaching or capstone experiences. Students are initially asked, or these, in this case, the students are aspiring educators, are initially asked if they have in fact used the skills that they learned as short as, say, 3 to 4 months ago. And then those aspiring educators that respond yes are then prompted to move on to the second stage of this second survey in the package. A few examples of the questions posed to those respondents that indicated that they had in fact used some of the skills with students include the following. Since your initial youth mental health first aid training, which aspects of the action plan known as ALGE have you applied with youth or students? Another example is, with how many students or young people have you applied aspects of the action plan known as ALGE in its entirety? And a third example is, as a result of your efforts in providing youth mental health first aid, in your own opinion, did your provision of those skills have a constructive impact with the students or the youth of concern? This particular slide here depicts data patterns with respect to responses from that initial cohort these past 2 years of students. A couple of important key considerations are of value, though, to note as we look at these data so that they can make more sense to people. First, the 604 respondents represents approximately that 25% of all the pre-service educators trained during this most recent 2 years. And second, which we believe is highly relevant, is that these pre-service educators completed the youth mental health first aid training, depending on their institution that they were attending, anywhere between their second semester sophomore year, well in advance of student teaching, all the way up through their first semester of their senior year, just prior to student teaching. In light of this second consideration, it's important to acknowledge that all these respondents were early in their professional careers, one would argue even in their pre-professional career paths, and not yet in schools on a daily, full-time basis, meaning that they had far less opportunity to actually engage with students than they would if it were the case where they were employed in schools on a daily basis. As depicted in these data, approximately 60% of these pre-service educators reporting implementing youth mental health first aid skills with students within this brief time period following up the initial training. Again, within a 3 to 4 month window following the training. Further, of this 60%, there was a relatively equal distribution of the use of the component parts associated with the skills learned through youth mental health first aid, which is referred to as ALGE. So what I want to emphasize here is what I've described here is simply one illustration of gathering additional targeted data to further inform practice with specific focus on the impact of professional development related to both trauma-informed approaches as well as explicit suicide prevention. Now Danielle is going to take us into the next component theme that we were looking at, which is really looking at situating suicide prevention within multi-tiered systems of support.
So building on our emphasis on the use of data, both data you already have access to and new targeted data that you gather, we want to emphasize the importance of viewing suicide prevention through the lens of multi-tiered logic. So just as suicide prevention training endeavors to somewhat normalize the topic of suicide prevention, it's helpful to view situating suicide prevention within MTSS framework in much of the same way, so it simply becomes embedded within the ebb and flow as to how schools operate. Suicide prevention, in an aligned manner with the increasing emphasis on trauma-informed approaches, should be an explicit presence across each of the tiers within MTSS. When we think about this at a conceptual level, there is a continuum of trauma-informed programs and practices associated with implementation of the PBIS framework that should be present at the universal, targeted, individualized, intensive, or indicated levels of the framework. So let's briefly tour through the array of programs and practices that we would like to encourage for you to consider across each of these three tiers. The core classroom-based practices associated with implementation of the PBIS framework serve as the cornerstones for trauma-informed universal prevention. And these practices include establishing 3 to 5 positively stated expectations, providing a high frequency of positive reinforcement of expectations, building rapport, varied and frequent opportunities to respond. Beyond the classroom, at the building level, the following core practices associated with systems and data serve as the foundation of universal prevention at the school building level. A functional universal prevention team, functional data systems, data used on an ongoing basis by the universal prevention team. Beyond these core PBIS trauma-informed approaches, schools are encouraged to select and employ an evidence-based social-emotional learning curriculum with a bully prevention and substance abuse prevention component, coupled with teaching students help-seeking behaviors through established curricula embedded within health education. Further, universal screening on social-emotional wellness for all students should occur in concert with providing professional development that emphasizes adverse childhood experiences and trauma, core preventative approaches that are trauma-informed across classrooms, and suicide prevention gatekeeper training. At the targeted or tier 2, the array of what have come to be known as traditional tier 2 supports, such as check-in, check-out, should be augmented by targeted approaches to further address the social emotional needs of students where warranted. Specifically, the installment of gated procedures to specifically conduct suicide risk assessments should be codified within school operations, as we previously noted earlier in this presentation. So the selection of which evidence-based suicide risk assessment instrument to employ, or really any evidence-based program or practice that we might consider across any of the tiers to embed within the framework, should be situated within a decision-making protocol to ensure the best ideal match between the instrument or the program within the school or context that it's going to be situated in. So one example of that type of a protocol is referred to as the hexagon tool exploring context. Additionally, established collaborative arrangements should be developed with local mental health provider agencies to provide access, ideally on school grounds, to targeted mental health treatment programs. So programs such as ART and CBITS provided by qualified mental health providers should be aligned to support student achievement during the school day to the greatest extent feasible. In an aligned manner with targeted supports, individualized, intensive, or indicated services and supports will continue to be needed by a portion of students with more pronounced or challenging needs. The level of support should, of course, continue to be driven by the alignment of a wraparound approach, possibly reflecting formalized person-centered planning in tandem with the design and delivery of individualized multi-component behavior support plans. Indicated suicide risk assessment, serving as the next gated level beyond Tier 2 suicide risk assessment, should be as well readily available when the need arises. Further, in alignment with our previous comments on targeted mental health treatment programming, indicated mental health programs such as CBT and DBT should be available through collaborative partnerships with local mental health providers. So in summary, it's essential to view suicide prevention within our normal thought process with respect to providing multi-tiered systems of supports for students.
So let's kind of catch our breath for a minute before we move into the last kind of segment in terms of the 4 themes that we had highlighted earlier today. Thus far, we've highlighted the use of readily available data, such as the PAYS that Danielle walked us through earlier. And then the gathering of additional targeted data. And an illustration of that was the youth mental health first aid training data that I shared with you on the pre-service side of the street through an initiative that we've been involved with. And then we've also covered just recently, as Danielle kind of toured you through, the importance of situating suicide prevention within the MTSS framework, and in particular, further normalizing the issue of social, emotional, behavioral wellness, mental health, as well as suicide prevention. These represent what we view as the core preventative approaches that we would really want you to take away from today's session in terms of the 3 real proactive component parts to be thinking about. However, we would be remiss if we did not address the topic that our experiences suggest is particularly awkward and uncomfortable for many to even think about, yet alone talk about. And that's being the what if scenario and the importance of being planned in advance for postvention in the event that it would be needed. None of us want to even think about, of course, yet even plan for the death of a student, staff member, or a community member by suicide. However, tragic events do happen, and it is better to have a plan in advance as opposed to trying to build a response from the ground up in the midst of such a crisis. Unfortunately, we've experienced a number of schools in the last few years within our region where the pre-planning was not as robust as clearly in retrospect they had hoped it was, or in some instances, even though they had thought about it, hadn't really operationalized it, and it really compounded the challenges that they were navigating. First and foremost, when we think about postvention, please understand that postvention is in fact prevention still, in that it's helping us to address what's known as contagion effect. Relatedly, while there's limited research on postvention in terms of empirical evidence, there is a pretty significant amount of empirical evidence as it pertains to contagion effect. And of course, layer on top of that the realities of what we're all collectively navigating with this pandemic. The focal point of postvention is to mitigate the risk of contagion, of course, or the spread effect, as well as addressing the immediate health, welfare, and safety needs of students, staff, families, and others in the community in adherence with federal and state guidelines that exist. Despite the limited empirical literature available on this topic of postvention, there are some valuable resources to utilize as you proactively plan for postvention. So you don't have to try to figure this out on your own or try to reinvent the wheel, so to speak. The resources that we found most valuable through our work with schools are noted at the end of this PowerPoint on the last few slides. A few essential considerations, which are more explicitly addressed in those noted resources, all place greatest emphasis on being planned in advance. Our experiences in helping schools navigate youth or staff death by suicide is that the absolute worst time to try to build such a plan is in the midst of actually navigating the loss of a life by suicide. A thoughtful postvention plan will somewhat manualize in writing an operational trail of breadcrumbs to address each of the features that are noted on this slide. With the limited time that we have left remaining here today, let's take a little deeper dive into these particular considerations on this slide. First, and obviously, in order to mobilize your local or perhaps regional crisis intervention or response team, the team needs to exist in the first place. So working from the premise that a crisis response team does exist, it's important that the lead person on the team confirm the accuracy of the information available concerning the circumstances surrounding the death. Once the information is confirmed, at least to the greatest degree feasible at that point in time, priority needs to be placed on the immediacy of the needs of the students and staff, with emphasis on those closest to the person who died by suicide. At the same time, it's important to try to maintain as close as possible a normal cadence for school routines, but do this in a flexible manner to meet the needs of individuals, as well as not to give off inadvertently the impression of appearing callous or insensitive to everybody's loss. This, of course, is much easier said than done in reality, but having a plan in advance to this effect can really help navigate the situation. Also, for obvious reasons, be sensitive to the possibility of contagion effect, which will in many ways be directly related to how the school community responds to the situation or the crisis at hand. Leadership is absolutely critical in this regard. In terms of communications, be sure to attend to the family of the student or staff member that died, with emphasis on students and staff within the school where the person attended or worked, as well as other schools where family members and friends attended it or worked as relevant. You also need to attend to the general community at large, inclusive of the school board and the membership comprising that school board, so they are aware. Be sure to designate a media spokesperson who will both oversee school-initiated communications, inclusive of social media, as well as field informational inquiries from the press or other local sources concerning the crisis. In this regard, be vigilant in monitoring social media posts that may organically emerge within the local community, particularly amongst the students. In terms of supporting students and staff, ensure that information is provided in a sensitive trauma-informed fashion to the best of your ability. Be sure to normalize the range of reactions individuals will likely experience, as there will predictably be a whole range of ways that people will react to the circumstances and the information or announcements being shared. Be sure to encourage, model, as well as share information about self-care and coping strategies as soon as possible to help minimize confusion, as well as to help those navigate the feelings and emotions and experiences that they're having in order for them to be able to best cope under the current circumstances. General practice in these types of instances is to provide a standard classroom announcement to best ensure reliability of the information communicated, and in turn offer access to more targeted supports, as well as identify individual students as well as staff that may be at greater risk, and of course provide more extensive access to supports as needed to those individuals in a timely manner as possible. Bottom line, it's important to apply a multi-tiered approach to postvention as well when considering the supports that all will need in the school community. Predictably, most students and staff will likely be able to sufficiently cope with access to universal postvention supports. Others, of course, may require additional levels of either targeted or more individual intensive supports. With respect to meeting the immediate needs of students and staff, assign a staff member, if possible, to follow the deceased student's or staff member's schedule to monitor peer and staff reactions and to address questions as they will likely arise. In the event that the deceased student or staff member has family and friends in other school buildings, provide monitoring throughout the day or the couple of days following the event in a parallel manner. If feasible, and again, being planned in advance may make the following more feasible than if not, acquire additional professionals to serve as floaters or additional support throughout the day, ideally for more than one day, but at a minimum 1 day immediately following the information being shared. In a related manner, provide timely and easy access with very few questions asked to crisis counseling. The goal is, of course, to make access as easy as possible to anybody who indicates both a need and or interest in speaking to someone. It's also predictable that the issue of memorialization will need to be addressed in the aftermath of a death by suicide. Ideally, the district will have in place a policy of memorialization when a student or staff member passes away, regardless of the circumstances. As a general guide in terms of memorialization, the loss of life is just that, the loss of life, which is tragic. And a death by suicide or some other form of tragic accident is still a tragic loss of life. Schools are encouraged not to differentiate how they memorialize the passing of a member of the school community, regardless of the circumstances as to how they pass. Along these same lines, be prepared in advance to track and respond to requests for memorializations, which will predictably, organically pop up. Focus to the greatest extent possible on how the student or staff member that passed away actually lived, not on how their life ended. Along these same lines, honor the person in a manner that does not inadvertently glamorize or romanticize either the person or the circumstances of their death. It is also very important to be sensitive to the cultural needs of the person's family and friends. Engaging the immediate family in a constructive and flexible manner is essential. Additionally, carefully monitor spontaneous memorials that may pop up in a manner that is both sensitive and helps the individuals grieve the loss while limiting the risk of glamorizing the death and also keeping in mind trying to mitigate the potential spillover effect or contagion effect that might naturally emerge. So these last two slides here, and Danielle, I'll just have you pop through the two of them and then maybe come back to this first one, simply lists a number of the resources that we have found particularly useful in our work with schools over the course of a number of years, but unfortunately, very intensively in a number of school districts these past 2 to 3 years, based on increasing rates of both attempts or deaths by suicide, particularly of youth in the rural part of central Pennsylvania where we're at. So a major concern that both Danielle and I, along with Kelly, had was trying to work our way through all of this content across those 4 thematic domains, so to speak, in a way that would allow adequate time to be able to process any questions or further extend conversation on any themes that emerged through the chat feature. So I think we've hit that target well. We're actually a little bit ahead of schedule, which means we probably really hustled through it. So I will apologize in retrospect if we threw too much too fast at people, but we were concerned about getting through the 4 domains of content in a way that would allow time for interaction. So Kelly, I'm going to turn it back over to you in terms of where do we start and pick up moving forward.
Sure. Thanks, Tim and Danielle, for those excellent tips and strategies and resources that you shared. I think the content here is excellent. There are already some questions that have been posted, and I'm going to read through those one at a time and give you a chance to respond. Those of you who are participating in the audience, if you have questions, please click on the polls tab and you can enter your question there. And if you have any comments, feel free to type those in the chat as well. And so first question, could you speak more to the steps that were taken from the example district about how they expanded their food program?
Sure. And again, I want to be clear, neither Danielle or I are employed by the school district, so our relationship with them has been kind of an external technical assistance guide over the years. But we can certainly speak to some extent to this, and I'm very confident that the people that coordinated this would be more than happy to share what strategies they used in greater depth. As Danielle had alluded to in that segment when she was talking about the PAYS data, this particular district, like I'm sure every district that's represented in this session, operated some type of meal programs already for kids based on economic thresholds and the like. They did a combination of different things to both, one, enhance that current program or expand it, as well as two, in light of COVID, when that hit, they further expanded that even further. So let me kind of respond to this in 2 ways. And Danielle, you can either correct me on anything I'm misstating and or expand on anything I initially put out there. First of all, in terms of their current program, one of the things that they were concerned about was that they were already running what they called a Panther Pack or a backpack after school food program for kids to be able to take home on the weekend. But the proportion of students that were eligible to participate in that was much lower than they had hoped. So they started to investigate that. And one of the primary themes was kind of the perceived stigma or issues around that in terms of how they were making those backpacks accessible to kids. So they really spent some time problem solving how to make this available in a non-invasive manner and somewhat normalize it, if you will. The other thing that they did, particularly at the upper grades, middle school and high school, is that they approached this from the standpoint of essentially creating food options for any kid that was hungry, even if it was for a snack during the day, where kids would just part and parcel if they were hungry, even if they had a big lunch, even if they ate 2 lunches, if they were still hungry, they could still stop by and grab something to eat. And that would be reasonably nutritious, not necessarily a bag of chips or something like that, or at least they tried to minimize use of those types of food sources. So they started to really try to normalize this issue of everybody needs food to eat. And in particular, it started to level the playing field for those students that actually were experiencing true food insecurities to be able to access. The other thing that they did once COVID obviously started to rear its head in a formal fashion was they really started to expand or consider how to expand this access beyond the traditional economic thresholds that were in place, so that if a kid needed access, they got access one way or the other, depending on the circumstances. So they really kind of looked at this comprehensively, but the primary focal point of their approach was how to destigmatize accessing the available food that would be available, particularly for those families that needed it. But the way to do that was to normalize it for everybody in the school community.
Thanks, Tim. The next couple of questions are similar, but just a little bit different. And I'm hoping that you can respond. And I know that in the resources, there's some information as well. But essentially, the questions are about gatekeeper trainings. Can you recommend some that are similar to youth mental health first aid, and other ideas about specific student gatekeeper programs?
Danielle, you want to take this one to start?
Yeah, sure. So the three suicide prevention trainings that the McDowell Institute offers, both within our community to local schools as well as on our campus, is youth mental health first aid, which is a pretty labor-intensive program. It's now 6.5 hours. It was 8. So, but that's a really long day. So we also offer question, persuade, refer training, which we kind of operate on a 2-hour basis. And it really focuses in very explicitly around suicide prevention, whereas youth mental health first aid looks a little bit more comprehensively around building mental health literacy. We also contract with an entity called Cognito to offer online virtual modules that are about 45 minutes for a participant to go through. Cognito is pretty cool because it does use avatar kind of gaming technology, but as I had said, we do contract with that entity. So that is something to also be, kind of cognizant about, is the price of some of these. Now, the ones that I've just kind of run over quickly are all evidence-based suicide prevention trainings. There are additional out there, others that are evidence-based, but these are the ones that we know pretty intimately. And I know you, Kelly, you asked about student suicide prevention trainings as well. We don't have as much personal familiarity with it because we do not, we're not credentialed in them, but I do know that mental health first aid does now have a teen version that is for, I believe, 10th through 12th grade is its target audience. And those operate in, I think it's 4 module days is kind of how they package them. And they're about 75 minutes a piece. And I know, Tim, you know others pretty well.
Yeah, the only thing I'll add, that's a good overview of the primary areas we're credentialed in or provide direct training ourselves in. And we consciously selected those. So we did kind of investigate the need for a whole continuum of options so that one can differentiate the gatekeeper training that's being provided to staff. I'll go back to the Milton example to illustrate a bit. In that particular district, they looked at providing comprehensive training to all of their teachers and paraprofessionals in question, persuade, refer, which they provided. They also provided youth mental health first aid training to targeted individuals, approximately 60 of them, that cut across multiple school buildings that had high impact areas in the arena of social emotional wellness, such as social workers, behavior intervention specialists, school psychologists, guidance counselors, school administrators, crisis interventionists, and some other aligned types of individuals. But then they also looked at providing training and have been rolling out training on a more incremental basis with their school cafeteria workers, their secretarial staff, and I don't believe they've launched yet, but I know is on the radar with their bus drivers as well. So the need to have a differentiated approach to aligning the curricula for both logistical needs in terms of time and resource intensity and sustainability, in tandem with what depth of understanding or exposure to a gatekeeper training does perhaps, say, a secretary need as compared to, say, a social worker need in this regard. The other thing I'll tag on a comment that is not an evidence-based training program. However, we actually are collaborating with some colleagues currently through the Garrett Lee Smith project at the state level, as well as Thomas Jefferson University, in running some pilot research, some beta testing, so to speak, of a couple of curricula that are not explicit suicide prevention curricula for students, but they are mental health literacy and awareness curricula for students. And there's two of them in particular, a VEDUM as well as another one known as Mind Matters. And one of those, a VEDUM, does deal more explicitly with the issue of suicide prevention. Now, those are not, I want to qualify, those are not empirically evidence-based at this juncture. Preliminary data are very encouraging about them. But there are curricula that are available that could be just embedded or situated within health education programs and or other types of curricular experiences for students. And they are traditionally, or these two are organized in kind of a unit block format where they take anywhere from about 2 to 4 hours to deliver the curriculum. So that could be done in a lump sum, or it could be broken into or situated into the ongoing schedule within, say, a middle school or a high school. Those two curricula are targeted for 7th grade and up. They are not designed for elementary or primary age, or certainly preschool age kids. The only other thing, and I'll try to be short on this, but I don't want to suck up all the time on this, is that even in, say, early childhood ed environments, there is very explicit relevance for providing gatekeeper training even in those environments. And we have been partnering as well with community-based entities through our 2 local United Ways to either provide ourselves or broker in training in these gatekeeper trainings for staff that work at those early childhood ed environment centers that feed into school systems.
Thank you. Just a couple of quick follow-ups on that particular question and your thorough responses before I move to the next one. Do you have information or resources to point to the evidence base of those programs? And I'm thinking maybe on those websites, but you can certainly expand. And then a comment really was to say signs of suicide through MindWise is evidence-based. And it sounds like we have a participant whose district has been using it for many years. So Tim, Danielle, anything you would add or comment there to those follow-ups?
Quick comment would be, again, the ones that we're highlighting was not to suggest they are the only evidence-based gatekeeper trainings out there. So I'm really glad that somebody made that clear to everybody else. These are simply the ones that we identified that we were going to invest our resources in based on knowing the local school systems that we were working with. So that's important to acknowledge. These are not the only ones out on the street. What was the first stem of that? There was a 2-parter. What was the first?
Sorry, just resource.
Oh, the evidence base.
Information about the evidence base. Yep.
And again, you could go to, for example, the Cognito website, and you would be able to access information on their evidence base. That's how we started to investigate these particular gatekeeper trainings. We went into their websites and looked at what they had. Some of the research is more robust than others in this regard. And I think each of the 3 that we're most familiar with, depending on how you want to define evidence base, each can make a claim of being stronger in one area than another as compared to the other 3. The emphasis, I would say, is no one size fits all. You need to be able to differentiate access to a variety of people. If you're really thinking about sustainability, including onboarding people into the induction process as they're hired into a school, rather than trying to retrofit them, trying to work upstream as they're actually onboarded as part of terms of employment.
Thank you. Next question, would you be willing to share the teacher surveys that you spoke about, or are those copyrighted?
Yeah, absolutely. They're not copyrighted. So we'd be more than happy. That's as simple as an email follow-up to Danielle or myself. And we certainly can share with you the series of the questions that we're using in Survey 1 and Survey 2. I do think that they were And when we designed them with the idea of generalizability to, say, in-service environments. The primary reason why we showcased as an illustration here the pre-service data is that's just where we have the most comprehensive database or the most robust data. We have utilized those surveys in the culture-based format with in-service educators and schools as well. It's just the database is not as complete in terms of response rates, and it's not universally been applied.
All right, thanks. So I did type in chat, Tim, I think we could take those questions and put them in a document and upload them into the file pod, and that way they'll be available with the recording and the other materials from this session. Okay, next question, which is really about universal screening. The question is, and I'm going to paraphrase just a little bit, that some professionals have encouraged online universal screeners, such as programs like Signs of Suicide. There are other professionals who have warned against it. What are your thoughts on universal screeners for mental health administered via online platforms?
I'm really glad the question surfaced because it is a proverbial Pandora's box in terms of the lack of full consensus, at least from our perspective in the field in this arena. Danielle, you want me to start on maybe responding a little bit, and then you can tag on however you see relevant. Let me go back to one of the examples that we had shared before in terms of gated screener. The PHQ-9 is an example of a suicide risk screener that we actually have some local school districts that have decided to use as a universal screener. And we had very explicit conversations with them about this very point, is that there are really mixed perspectives on this, and that it was not necessarily designed to be used at a universal screening level, but more further down the road in a gated screening process for kids that would emerge. The bottom line is school systems are going to make local decisions based on what they see as their local priorities. We have had within this region, given the proportional size of the schools in the region, we have had, I don't think I can accurately say a disproportionate level of suicide attempts or deaths by suicide, but we had gone through about an 18 to 24 month window in a lot of the neighboring school districts to one another. And a lot of kids and families know each other across district lines, yet alone within the district, where this was particularly raw and sensitive. And the district felt compelled that they needed to do a number of things yesterday, and if not yesterday, immediately. So this issue of universal screening surfaced. So our approach with schools that have moved in this arena of using the PHQ-9 to illustrate as a universal screener is to really emphasize that if you are going to be doing that, you need to also have in place designed universal screening for social, emotional, behavioral wellness, so that you can then somehow situate this in that as a gated mechanism. A couple of these schools did not have universal screening in place whatsoever in the region. So they gravitated to putting suicide risk assessment screening in place prior to actually having a universal screener in place generically for all of the kids in some type of a systematic fashion. So our point of emphasis with them is saying, all right, this boat's kind of sailed and you've gone here. You need to move quickly to build capacity to get universal screening in place so that you can then push this more into a gated screening mechanism as it was originally designed to be used, as our understanding is. Danielle, anything to add to that at all? Or am I missing something based on what we've been doing with the schools in the region? This goes beyond Milton, to be clear. And for what it's worth, Milton is not one of the schools that took, say, the PHQ-9 and inserted it as a universal screener. Just to qualify that, because we did use their data earlier, so I don't.
Yeah, no, that was very helpful, I think. No, I think what you've shared in our experiences was hopefully helpful. And I do think that based on where a lot of schools in our area are at in relation to, not having necessarily all their students in the school or not even having any students in school, this is going to be something that a lot of districts are going to be navigating. Do they even screen right now? Or how do they go about doing that in a way that is safe for the student and that the staff can be responsive to those needs? And I think from our perspective, that's really what it's about. If you're going to screen, you need to make sure that you can meet the needs of the students in a very timely manner, because information is going to come up. So I don't want to take any more time on that. So Kelly, if you want to ask the next question.
Sure, we have about 5 minutes left.
Kelly, real quick, there is one thing, Danielle, it just jumped to mind when I was listening to you, and I know you and I have had conversations about this that I do think is important to share. Neither Danielle or I are mental health licensed practitioners. We are both educators by trade. So one of the first things that we started to do a few years back was to formulate really close relationships with colleagues at the state level, as well as local, but particularly at the state level. And I'm thinking such as Dr. Rosen with the Garrett Lee Smith initiative at the state level. This is the arena of expertise they have. So these are our go-to people. So our ability to even, for example, provide guidance to schools on the use of screening has been informed by those people that have credential and expertise in this arena. And I share that for two reasons. One is as a disclaimer for us, I guess, first and foremost, but equally in terms of guidance, as you're navigating, looking at situating suicide prevention within the MTSS framework in your endeavors, you really want to have those go-to close relationships with people that this is their area of discipline or expertise, because this is what they're trained in. It is not the field we're trained in. We are educators that we are vicariously absorbing as much as we can through our experiences in supporting schools.
Right. And I'll just add to that, Tim, further to say that we do have resources available at PBIS.org around universal screening. And of course, it is certainly a hot topic as we navigate this, of course, unusual school year where students may be virtual or in a hybrid learning mode as opposed to all in school. There's one more question that I want to make sure that we get to before we close out our time. And I think it's really important. And ironically, a session that was happening at the same time as this one was on adult wellness. And as you all know by now, all these sessions are recorded. And so we all get to benefit from being able to go back and listen to those sessions that we couldn't join while we were in this one. But nevertheless, the question is wisely bringing up the point that right now it says educators have their workloads piling up, especially because of COVID. They're experiencing more emotional and mental stress than ever before. How can we seek to meet the emotional and mental health needs of colleagues with the greatest impact and prevent suicide among our peers? And there's another comment with the question that says, I can't say for sure, but would imagine that if a trusted adult at school ended their life, this would have certainly a big impact for students in school. I certainly appreciate the comments and the question. Very much is something that we've been thinking a lot about among our groups. But Tim and Danielle, I'll let you respond to the question.
Danielle, I'll let you go first, other than to say we have a couple hours to talk about this one. Is that correct?
Yeah, well, I think we all kind of know, whether from our own personal experiences with how we're individually navigating the circumstances, or, from speaking with our colleagues and our friends and our families, it's a very trying time. I actually recently participated in a webinar focused on this topic, and a lot of the guidance that was shared, and I think makes a lot of sense, but frankly, I certainly didn't think about applying it to myself. And it was very readily available information to me, and information that I had known for a long time. If you're working virtually in any capacity, giving yourself a time and saying, I'm done here. Like at this is my time to work. This is my time to serve my students and work with my peers, but I need some space, because it can be really challenging. So kind of setting that time frame for yourself, as you might have when you're inside of a physical school building, making sure you're disconnecting, taking time for yourself, and knowing that your very best is what you can do at this time. So if you don't have the time or the energy to make an amazing Google Classroom that is completely animated, that it's okay, that you're serving your students as best as you possibly can with kind of the bandwidth that you have. So to me, those are some of the things that really just resonated, because I know I always want to do my best. And being there, checking in with other people, connecting in a way that's, kind of best meets an individual's need, is something that we should be doing all the time, but is really important to do right now.
And I would jump in there real quick with kind of two angles of response. One is crisis intervention, and the other one is prevention. On the crisis intervention side, I would argue the same set of skills that we learn through gatekeeper training are equally applicable when we're supporting colleagues that we might pick up on are indicating signs of emotional distress. And the key one is being present with them, listening non-judgmentally to them, and letting them know that somebody cares about them and hears them. And then following or adhering to those basic gatekeeper rules that come with the territory, depending on whatever gatekeeper training that someone may have gone through that they're familiar with. On the preventative side, and this is actually something we've been talking about at a regional level through a regional community of practice, not our statewide one, is that a lot of times on the prevention side, it's the little things that really make a difference. And I'll give you a really concrete example of this. At a regional level, one of the things that we've been concerned about is the enormous stress that are on school administrators in trying to navigate all this. So one of the strategies at a regional level has been this collective community of practice has put together kind of little acknowledgement and goodie bags that they've sent to the school district administrators, just saying, we're in this with you, and we just can't explain enough how much we appreciate what you're doing. It's the little things that make a difference. And when you think about it, I know this as a teacher, it means a whole lot more if another teacher says something to me that's acknowledging something that I did that they think really made a difference, or acknowledging the heavy lift that I'm doing at that moment in time because I'm navigating a lot of things, whether they're professional, personal, or the combination of the two. So sometimes it doesn't have to be real large, grandiose, high ticket types of things, but rather strategic, low hanging fruit that is sustainable in terms of what are little gestures of kindness that we can be doing, but to create a systematic process to actually have that start to occur on some type of regular basis. Not too fundamentally different if we think about the core elements of incentivizing, if you will, reinforcement procedures for teachers in implementation and delivery of reinforcement to students. Conceptually, it's the same mindset, but to generalize that to just acknowledging these are difficult times and the feelings that people are experiencing, it would be abnormal to not feel scared. It would be abnormal not to feel down or depressed. This is very normal under these pandemic circumstances. But then to put in place little kind of gestures of kindness can really go a long way therapeutically.
Thank you. There are no other questions that were posed for today. It looks like our time has ended for this breakout. Again, we thank you for your participation and hope you have a good rest of the day.
Look out there.
Great job.
We're offline, I take it?
And the meeting is still running, I believe. Can we end it now?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.